The smell hits you before you even reach the door. Not the smell of poverty, something older than that, something that is soaked into the brickwork and the floorboards and the very air itself, until the air is no longer quite air at all. You stand at the threshold of the Victorian London slum in the winter of 1880, and every instinct in your body is telling you to turn around and walk away. You cannot. This is home. London in 1880 is the largest city on earth. More than 4 million souls packed into a sprawl of soot-blackened streets, gaslit thoroughfares, and grand imperial monuments. All of it built on a foundation of extraordinary misery that the guidebooks never mention. But you're not visiting the guidebook London. You are not walking through Mayfair or admiring the new embankment. You have come to Whitechapel, to Bermondsey, to the warrens of St. Giles and the festering courts of Seven Dials. You have come to the places that polite society looks away from, and you're going to live inside them, because for roughly a third of London's population, there is simply no other choice. The court you live in has no official name. The locals call it a yard. It is perhaps 12 feet wide at its broadest point, hemmed in on all sides by 5-story tenement buildings, so tall and so close together that direct sunlight reaches the ground for perhaps 40 minutes a day in midsummer, and not at all between October and March. The cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with a layer of grime that defies description. A compound of mud, ash, horse dung, rotting vegetable matter, and substances you have learned not to identify. The damp is not a weather condition here. It is a permanent physical presence, something you wear on your skin like a second coat. Your room, singular, always singular, measures roughly 14 feet by 10. You share it with your wife, your 3 children, and, on the worst weeks of winter, your wife's brother and his family, who have been turned out of their previous lodgings for falling behind on rent. 8 people, 1 room, 1 window, cracked at the lower pane and stuffed with a rag to keep out the worst of the draft, though the draft comes anyway, coiling around your ankles and settling in your chest like something living. The walls are papered over with old newspaper, not for decoration, but for insulation, and the paper has gone dark with damp and soot until the words are illegible, which is just as well, because most of them are old enough to be cruel. Reports of prosperity, announcements of progress, the march of the empire. There is no heating. There is a fireplace, but coal costs money, and the weeks when you can afford coal and food simultaneously are becoming rarer. On the coldest nights, you burn whatever is available, scraps of wood, broken furniture, the occasional piece of clothing that is past beyond repair. The children sleep in their coats. You sleep in yours. The chill that you feel when you wake at 5:30 is not the sharp, refreshing cold of the countryside. It is the damp, soot-laden cold of a city that produces heat in industrial quantities and distributes almost none of it to the people who need it most. The water situation is something that you have made a kind of peace with, the way you make peace with all the things that cannot be changed. There is 1 standpipe serving the entire court, perhaps 40 families, perhaps more. The counting is difficult when people move in and out of rooms and cellars, and even the stairwells in the worst of winter. The standpipe runs for 1 hour in the morning, between 6 and 7, and the queue forms before 5. If you miss the hour, you buy water from a carrier at a price that represents a meaningful fraction of her daily wage, or you use water from the Thames, which by 1880 is cleaner than it was before the great stink of 1858 forced the construction of Bazalgette sewers. But cleaner is not the same as clean, and you know this in your stomach quite literally several times a year. The food you eat is dictated entirely by what remains after rent is paid. Rent is 7 shillings a week for your single room, collected by a deputy who represents a landlord you have never met and will never meet, a man who owns perhaps 40 properties in this district and lives in a villa in Islington. 7 shillings is a brutal extraction from a wage that, if you are in regular work, which is never guaranteed, amounts to perhaps 18 or 20 shillings in a good week. What remains after rent buys bread? Always bread first. Then, if there is anything left, potatoes, dripping, the occasional piece of neck of mutton that has been simmering in a pot for 3 days to make it edible. Your children are thin in a way that is visible from across the room. Not starving. Starvation is the step below this. and you have not fallen that far yet, but a thinness that has become structural, as if their bodies have simply reorganized themselves around the absence of enough. By midnight on a February night, the court is quiet in the way that exhausted places are quiet. Not peaceful, but depleted. The public house on the corner closed at 11, and the men who spent the evening there have made their way home or not, depending. You can hear, through the wall that separates your room from the next, the sound of a child coughing. The deep, rattling cough that you recognize and dread. The cough that has taken 2 children from the family in the room below yours in the past 3 years alone. Consumption, the doctor would say, if you could afford a doctor, which you cannot. Tuberculosis, the scientific men are beginning to call it. Since Robert Koch identified the bacillus in 1882, though that discovery is still 2 years away from this February night. And in any case, the naming of the thing does nothing to slow its progress through buildings like this one, where 12 people share the air in a space meant for 3. And the air itself is filthy with the exhalations of the sick and the damp and the coal smoke and the rot. 3 hours later, at 3 in the morning, you are woken by the sound of the night soil men in the court below. The cesspits beneath the older buildings in this district are still in use. Bazalgette's sewers serve the main streets, but the connections to individual courts and alleys are incomplete, and many landlords have declined to pay for the connection, calculating correctly that their tenants have no power to compel them. The night soil men come in the dark hours by arrangement and by tradition, shoveling the accumulated waste of dozens of families into carts that will carry it to the processing yards east of the city. The fumes that rise through the floorboards in these minutes are suffocating in a way that is almost hallucinatory. You press your face into your coat and wait for it to pass. The children do not wake. They have learned to sleep through this the way they have learned to sleep through everything. As dawn approached on a morning in January 1880, a woman named Sarah, we know her name from a parish record and a single entry in a workhouse ledger, carried her youngest child, an infant of 7 months, through the streets of Bermondsey to the door of the workhouse on Tanner Street. She had been widowed 4 months earlier when her husband died of a fever contracted in the tannery where he worked. She had 3 other children at home, the eldest 8 years old. She could not feed all 4 of them and had made the calculation, catastrophic, rational, devastating, that the infant had a better chance inside the workhouse than in the room she was paying 4 shillings a week to inhabit. The workhouse took the child. Sarah walked home. We do not know what happened to her after that. The record ends. This is the detail that rewrites everything you thought you understood about this world. It is not that people in these slums were ignorant of their condition. They knew exactly what was happening to them and why. In 1883, a journalist named Andrew Mearns published a pamphlet called The Bitter Cry of Outcast London, which described conditions in the slums with a precision and fury that scandalized the middle classes and contributed directly to the Royal Commission on the Housing of the Working Classes, which reported in 1885. What Mearns found, what genuinely horrified even the investigators who believed they were prepared, was not simply the physical filth, the overcrowding, the disease. It was the intelligence of the people living inside it, the strategies, the calculations, the relentless, exhausting mental labor required simply to survive another week inside a system that had been engineered, whether deliberately or through indifference, to extract the maximum possible rent from the minimum possible space while providing nothing in return. Families kept meticulous mental accounts of every farthing. Women in the slums of Whitechapel and Bermondsey developed intricate networks of mutual credit. Informal systems in which a neighbor with 2 shillings to spare this week would lend to the family that was short, knowing that the favor would be returned. Because in these courts, everyone was short at some point, and the only insurance against catastrophe was each other. When a child fell dangerously ill, it was the women of the court who sat with the mother through the night, who brought what food they had, who kept the fire going when there was anything to burn. The extraordinary solidarity of the Victorian slum was not a romanticized myth. It was a survival mechanism, and it was real, and it worked imperfectly, often tragically, but well enough that people endured. The ingenuity extended to the physical fabric of life. Clothing was repaired beyond any point that would be recognizable as repair today, turned patched, cut down from adult to child to rag, and finally to stuffing for a broken window. Food was stretched with a relentless creativity that modern cookbooks have occasionally tried to replicate without ever quite capturing what it meant to make something edible out of almost nothing, day after day, in a room with no proper cooking facilities and no margin for waste. Bootmakers' children went without boots. Women who made matchboxes by the thousand. A farthing for a gross, which is 144 boxes, which takes approximately 2 hours, developed a remarkable resilience in their hands even as the phosphorus destroyed their jaws. They kept working. They kept feeding their children. They forged a life out of material that the rest of the city had discarded. What you carry away from this place, from the slick cobblestones and the suffocating midnight air and the sound of that child coughing through the wall, is not only horror. It is something harder to name and more difficult to dismiss. These are not broken people. They were people being broken by a system, and they were resisting that breaking with every resource they had, which was almost nothing, and they were often succeeding. Not triumphantly, not completely, but enough. Enough to get the children through another winter. Enough to be here next week. Enough to matter. The slums of Victorian London were eventually cleared, not by charity or conscience alone, but by a combination of public health legislation, trade union organization, social reform movements, and the kind of slow, grinding pressure that only becomes visible in retrospect. The Boundary Estate in Bethnal Green, opened in 1900, replaced the old nickel slum with council housing that had running water and proper ventilation. The first municipal housing estate in the world. It was not the end of poverty, but it was a remarkable acknowledgement that the city owed something to the people who built it. The next time you walk through a London street at night, and the lamplight catches the wet pavement in a certain way, think of what that pavement has witnessed. Think of the calculations that were made on top of it. Think of everything that was endured so that the city you inhabit could become what it is. The distance between that world and this one was not inevitable. It was fought for, inch by inch, by people who had almost nothing to fight with. In our next video, we go even deeper into the Victorian underworld, into the cellars beneath the slums, where an entire hidden population lived in conditions so extreme that even the workhouse inspectors refused to enter alone. Subscribe now, and do not miss it.